Oh, that's fantastic. And I know you've been able to do a lot of those really interesting industries around the world. So I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. I'm going to go ahead and step aside and leave the stage to you. And if you need any help, let us know, and we're here to support you.
Thanks, Chris, and everybody. Chris is Chris and Christy. They're just longtime friends. I consider them family. We're also neighbors in Lake Tahoe. I mean, quite literally, live down the street from one another, and we hang out as much as we can. The the thing that I admire most about Chris and Christy, and also Tina, Tina's been ahead of this conversation even before any of us really started to explore it seriously. Well before that. Uh, it's just that it's good people, as Tina said. We're all just people trying to make the world a better place, like the tenets of Burning Man, if you will. One is leave no trace, and I think the other thing is just make the world better after you leave it. Is probably what inspires my work. So I'm not going to entertain you with PowerPoint slides today. I hope that's okay. But I think back to the early days of what Chris and Christy set out to do with social media club, which was about building a community. And even before that, it was about sharing knowledge. I think Chris's old tagline, maybe it still is tagline, if you get it, share it. I think back to one of our other friends, Chris Sod, who we were all on his board back for data portability, which was sort of the early concepts of a wallet, if you will, which is what represents itself to be sort of the potential of the future of Web3. What I wanted to talk to you about is where we are and where we need to be. I got to imagine that you're here today because you've built some aspect of the future or the present. You're building some aspect of the future. And I wonder if together we couldn't collaborate around or co-create even around a better version of the Web3 that we see today. What Chris didn't mention is that I'm a longtime digital analyst, a longtime digital anthropologist. And so I study digital trends. I study how digital affects people in a variety of ways. Not just from business standpoints, but from personal standpoints. So, for example, my last book was Life Scale, and it explored how digital was changing us as people, how we show up in our relationships at work, in our friendships, how we are present or not present in the moment, how we focus or don't focus, and how we're kind of led astray by the world that we live in social, and the world that we needed to live and the life that we needed to live aside from that projection, on how those two things were sort of not in alignment. And it's not really clear until something goes wrong or you feel a certain way. And certainly what we're seeing in so much research, even research I publish, is that even though the promise of it was so wonderful, I mean, this is how most of us came together. It did in fact have negative impacts and consequences that we're sort of starting to understand and still reeling from. But I share that because I'm a hopeless optimist, and I was one of the biggest champions of social media, and I still believe in its promise. I don't necessarily believe in the capitalism behind it and how it sort of evolved, but I do think it's not too late. But those same principles can apply and should apply to Web3 or whatever we want to call it. And there's a difference between that vision or that aspirational sense of what Web3 could be and where we are today. Certainly, the hype cycle would have many aspects of Web3 in the hype cycle, like metaverse. If you would even say that the version of the metaverse that exists is considered Web3, but blockchain, NFTs, crypto. And that's not a bad thing, right? Everything in Gartner's hype cycle goes through this level of excitement, which is where we're at. And then we sort of go into this trough of disillusionment, which is kind of the sobering moment where we realize all these things that we thought were going to create this next big, exciting thing weren't necessarily the right thing, but it did lay the foundation for what we can build in terms of utility and scale from there. Just to give you an example, as Chris mentioned, our good friend Jeremiah Ayang and another good friend of ours, Gregarious, they were helping helping me understand some of the trends that were taking place. And I'll never forget sharing with them as I was getting my .eth, like so many of us have, and the story of how Coinbase's utility of just simply transferring ETH into the wallet to execute got caught up in a 72 to 96 hour hold, of which just wouldn't complete the transfer. And there was no sense of service to assist in that transfer. And I remember saying that this is exactly why where we are today and the promise of what we say we can do today is nowhere close to the utility, the security, uh, the the very foundational elements of making things work the way that they should. We're just not there. And that's where I want to begin today's story. I know that we only have a handful of minutes, and I'll do my best to wrap up and see if we can't get to any questions that you might have, or maybe I have questions and you have the answers. But look, the growing dominance of this discussion that we're seeing around cryptocurrency, blockchain, NFTs, they're sort of defining what this idea of Web3 is about. The idea of decentralization is big, even though we don't really see any decentralized networks. I mean, the data is still owned by probably third parties, run by third parties, servers are run by third parties. Uh, so the promise of restoring power to users and creators, to shift from consumers to stakeholders, to even evolve from creators to co-creators, that paradigm was one that we see today that's more like what social media ended up becoming, right? So the goal, I believe, of us getting together today and beyond, right? Chris is really good about bringing people together and growing ideas together and creating a community together. Is that promise of Web3, where we are today, is why Web2, you could say, failed or is failing to live up to its promise. Web3 is built on transparency, and it's also built upon accountability, security, decentralization, as Chris mentioned, trustless networks, and most importantly, community. And these digital assets that we're creating or that we're buying or that we're selling, they're actually not as much of assets are as they are as tokens to communities, to people, to ideas, to aspirations, to values together. And it's not about what we're going to drop. It's not about our exclusive club. It's not about launching a new altcoin. It is not about elitism. At least it's not supposed to be, right? Because otherwise, we're going to look at the hype cycle of Web 1 and the later years of Web 2, which is probably why Jack Dorsey, when he tweeted out that we don't own Web3, that VCs and their limited partners do, and that he was cautioning us to be careful of what we fund, what we advise, what we create, and what we buy. I don't know if you know this, but the top 9 accounts or 9% of accounts in Web3 hold 80% of the 41 billion market value of NFTs. That the top 2% of accounts own 95% of the $800 billion supply of Bitcoin. And that 0.1% of Bitcoin miners are responsible for half of all mining output. That's already pretty elite, right? So what we're starting to see is money, popularity. We're seeing NFTs used as social signals. We're seeing the projection of these lifestyles. How many currencies have Lamborghinis as their mascot? So if you think about what went wrong with social media, is that we created sort of like the worst version of ourselves as a form of projection, right? And that affected with our self-esteem, our self-confidence. It made us operate a little bit more superficially. Definitely made us multitask and spread ourselves all over the place. It's almost impossible to be present in the moment or expect someone else to be present in the moment. And yet, if we look at a lot of the conversations that are taking place at this year's South by Southwest, they're all of the things that we've talked about, right? But not what this conference represents. As Chris mentioned, we see theft, we see copying, especially on NFTs, all over the place. In fact, losses from crypto scams this last year totaled 14 billion. Uh, I think crypto fraud is up 80% from 2020. I got caught in a big conversation about what to do about artists who are losing revenue and opportunities based on people stealing or copying their work and minting it. And for example, OpenSea, they don't necessarily have an infrastructure, and some would argue that they shouldn't have an infrastructure in a decentralized world to alert artists that this is happening to them. And it's a very manual process for artists, even one, to know that it's happening, and then two, the amount of effort it takes for each artist to actually chase this down and do something about it. In fact, many cases, one artist I spoke to said that he had just given up, and he's one of the more popular artists out there, and it was heartbreaking. So look, the reality is we are where we are now because people don't really want to run their own servers. They don't want to have to write code. They're not necessarily as experienced with the generation of optimized and scalable smart contracts. So the way that this promise of Web3 is going to work is really going to come down to what you and I decide we're going to do differently together moving forward. Uh, if you think about what Web 2 really did, was it made us as users the product, made our data a currency of which we don't necessarily benefit from. We get all the worst things, not necessarily all the best things. But now we could become an asset. So hence, like the idea of a wallet and a collaborator, and then a collaborator in the next economy. We can shift from this mode of consumerization to becoming a stakeholder. Think about a DAO, or think about holding an asset that's part of a community. That we can become creators and co-creators in defining what this future looks like, that we can discover utility and build toward it, even if it isn't fully decentralized yet, creating more value than just this idea of success. We know that there's great potential in blockchain technology. We know that there's great potential in tokens and smart contracts. And this innovation isn't just going to be enduring. It's going to be built upon the lessons we learn from this initial wave that we're experiencing now. It just has to be better than what exists or what already existed in the past. All right, so let's have a conversation, for example, about the best of Web3 and the worst of Web3 in an area that we don't necessarily see the light, or that doesn't necessarily see the light as much as it should, right? And that's sustainability. We're going through climate change. Christy and I live in a beautiful part of the world that is not normal. Last summer, we experienced a bunch of wildfires. We ended up having to evacuate, and we're not seeing as much snow this winter as we should. So we know the world is changing. But crypto mining, for example, consumes more energy than small countries, and that's not a joke. Actually, the Cambridge Bitcoin Electricity Consumption Index tracked that. Some miners have purchased or built power plants to dedicate to their mining. Only about 12% of energy comes from renewables in general. Right, so what about offsetting this? What about building those offsets into the paradigm? What about creating technology that reduces this carbon footprint as we're writing every transaction to the blockchain? What if it's just part of the ecosystem? I'm spending a lot of my time when I think about Web3, when I think about community. I have this abbreviation as hashtag WDYSF. What do you stand for? Because I think this is that moment in time where you're sitting at a crossroads, and I can follow this path of hype and excitement around Web3. Don't get me wrong, a lot of our friends are here, and it is exciting. Or we can do all of the things we didn't do with Web2 and social, and get it right out of the gate. I think about, as Tina and Chris were speaking at the beginning of this, around human centricity, having things be human centered, and that's another way of saying empathetic. People don't always know what they want, people don't always know what they need, but they certainly know it when they see it. And I think that's part of the opportunity here. Otherwise, we're just using this new technology to iterate, to do what we did before, but call it something else. Whereas we have the opportunity with innovation to create net new value. And when it comes to empathy and seeing and feeling the world through the eyes of another and looking for those opportunities to create, I think about the golden rule of life. And that golden rule is to treat others how you want to be treated. But this idea of possibility is also treat others how they want to be treated. And that becomes truly human centered. I think about the opportunity for innovation around what my colleague Henry King and I call relationship transformation, or RTX for short. It's using technology and innovation, design, concepts, invention, to think about how can we transform the relationship that we have with one another? How can we transform the relationship we have with customers or stakeholders? How can we transform the relationship that we have with processes and technologies and outcomes, and essentially use relationship transformation to define how we use technology to create the types of collaborative communities that we want to see and what we build those upon. So blockchain, crypto, alt, whatever we give that sense of purpose to these things, rather than making these things give us these fleeting senses of purpose and meaning right now. Right. So, for example, we could consider NFTs not just digital art, but as a membership for an exclusive group of people who have common aspirations and who are willing to be part of something that's bigger than them in order to create a new alternative future that didn't exist before that NFT or before that DAO. It's sort of this new form of loyalty and community, right? Where NFTs become an asset. They attract new customers. They appeal to people because there's greater value in just the asset of itself. That it becomes a form of validation, but also authentication. It creates new value. That we look at ways of building not just entities or organizations or businesses, but also as outcomes, as experiences. So we break the traditional confines of how we think about construction or currencies or exchanges, and we make them more about the outcomes that happen as a result of these new platforms. And I think that's where none of this stuff really exists in those forms. That what if we were trustless aspects of this new ecosystem? And as Chris said, you have to have trust in order to be trustless. So that means that we have a lot of work to do in what we create, because much of it doesn't exist. How we sell, because it's certainly going to be different than how we're selling a lot of this today. I think if South Park is already tackling NFTs, then that means we have some work to do. So look, Web3 as it is isn't going to solve our problems. In fact, it's probably perpetuating many of our problems. So as a hopeless optimist, I want to envision and build a more decentralized technology ecosystem. I want to build a less toxic and elite internet. I want to foster a more equitable society and a better world for all. And the path that we're on is not the path that's going to get us there. And that's, I think, why we're here together. That's the opportunity. We get to create the future. We get to define not only the trajectory that we were on, but an entirely new trajectory altogether. We're not striving to a new normal of Web3 to get us through the hype cycle. We're actually striving for an alternate trajectory that gives it utility and meaning, that builds a sense of community, that has a more sustainable impact, that creates all of the right things for all of the right reasons. And we're going to have to get through this phase. And the only way to get through that phase is because you start building, and we start building things that are better, more meaningful, more purposeful. And that might not get us all of our Lamborghinis with the name of our coin on the side of it, but it's certainly going to create a better place for all. And that's why I say that community is so much more than belonging to something. It's about doing something together that makes belonging matter. So with that said, I think I'm over time, and Chris, maybe I can bring you back and say thank you to everybody for following along. I think you're on mute there, Chris.
It's impossible for me to cut you off when you are getting into that. And, it's one of the reasons we love you so much, and for you to be such a stand for this. And it's also part of the reason I have hope, knowing that there are business leaders like yourself out there who understand this, are making a difference, and are actually touching, people's lives. I'm sure the individuals at the show itself are going to be quite delighted. I see the tweets coming out of every show that you do when you're running around the world of all the people who have touched you, or have touched the content that you create and have been touched by you. And that's, God, that sounds terrible. That's not what we mean, obviously. I'm so sorry. I'm at a loss. Christy's trying to tell me what to do in the background, as you might imagine, and I'm like, what is she talking about? But what we're talking about is we've got to get going. We're way over time, Brian. I'm sorry to say that. I got to get you moving on. I really appreciate you coming by and sharing today, and we'll carry that message forward, I'm sure, throughout the day. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, everyone.